Welcome everyone to Agronomic Alchemy, Facts on Phosphorus. I'm James Patterson, joined alongside Molly Alexander and Rob Dedman. And here we're talking about phosphorus. What is it? Where does it come from? And why is it important to plants? The first thing we know is phosphorus, obviously, guys, is it's not found in a produced form. Yeah, this is something that happens over millions of years. Basically, it's marine life, plant matter that becomes sedimentary. What sedimentary mean? It forms an element by reacting to something and becomes geological. It's like a rock in the soil. So it's a
It's a rock.
non-renewable resource. And it's something that we rely on, but I don't really think we think about the fact that we can't just make phosphorus. There's only a limited amount of it. So if there's a limited amount of it, why don't we start the conversation off by why is it important? So if I'm going to grow a crop now and we want to boil this down to the simplest form, why do I need phosphorus?
So, James, I'll start that off. And why is phosphorus important in a plant's life? It's to start it off. We've got to start a plant off as a seedling. We've got to start off with a strong root system. We start strong, we finish strong. The plenty of phosphorus. We see a lot of soils in the U.S. that we have trouble getting plenty of phosphorus in early. Why is that? Because of a lot of times, temperature can play a role in that and the reaction for the phosphorus to become available to the plant. So we start off cold. Phosphorus is not readily available. The microbes aren't digesting the phosphorus like they need to. And then we have to get it warmed up to start getting more phosphorus in the plant. So we've got to start with a strong root system, and then we lead off into, strong stalks, strong shoots, however you want to, what do you want to call it? But it leads off into that to build a strong plant.
Well, there's other limiting factors too that are sometimes overlooked when we are looking at phosphorus needs early. You mentioned one, which is temperature, but the other one that's a huge factor is pH. So a lot of times pHs, we got a range all across the country in different forms of pH. And then we have inputs as far as, maybe some lime or stuff that guys have added on to try to help with that. And when has that kicked in? Like, when has that become effective? So now that also plays into phosphorus availability. And then we have the conversation about micronutrients. So the biggest relationship between phosphorus is with zinc. So if we look at some of our soils and we have zinc limitations as well, that also affects phosphorus availability. So from the very get-go, one of the major budget inputs that a farmer has is it not seed. And when they look at seed, they're paying a lot of money for what is an estimated yield average out of that seed. If we don't provide enough phosphorus when they plant that seed, we don't have the correct start to push that plant to its estimated yield potential. So we're already starting off with limitations, and at that point, we're always going to be continuing to play catch up throughout the growing season. So without having a really good basis, a really good start with phosphorus availability, then it's just a continuous game of how and when and where can we push that plant to get the most value out of the seed that we spent so much money on. So there's several factors affecting that.
So we talked about the importance there on two things. So Rob, you spoke about the importance of phosphorus for early development. You've also talked about the importance of phosphorus as a tool to apply to the soil. But let's talk about it more in nature. Yeah, so let's talk about where phosphorus comes from in the first place. So when you're talking about adding phosphorus, we have to add phosphorus for a reason. And this is probably a little unknown reason for a lot of people, where their phosphorus fertilizer comes from. So we talked about this point before about this being sedimentary. So sedimentary means it's essentially geological. It's something that formed over millions of years. And it formed from either plant matter or marine matter, and basically comes from bones that solidify and form an element. So when we make phosphorus fertilizer, it's one of the most interesting facts is that when you look at where phosphate mines are, so phosphate occurs across every acre of soil in the United States. Everybody out there that has a field essentially has their own mini phosphate mine. The limiting factor is they don't have a high enough concentration to be able to take it to mine to use. So we go to places like Florida. Yeah, Florida, obviously close to it's on the coast, yeah, and it's somewhere where over millions of years we formed a mineral called apatite, which is what? Calcium phosphate. And it accumulates. And so when we make phosphorus fertilizer, we take calcium phosphate and we split it. And what's the way we split it? Acids, yeah?
Yeah.
Right.
How does a plant access phosphorus?
Yeah. So the plants
It has to be in the orthophosphate form.
Yeah. And how do they make it available?
It has to be water soluble.
Root exudates the acids that the plant releases.
Acids. And what are the acids doing?
They're breaking it apart. They're breaking it apart.
Lowering the pH to bring it into solution and make it available to plants. So when we mine phosphorus fertilizer, what are we doing? We're taking high concentration soils, essentially, yeah, that have a very high amount of apatite, calcium phosphate. We add a very strong acid to it, which gives us free phosphorus, and then we ammoniate it and granulate it to then apply it back to our soils.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's soils in the United States come with an element of phosphorus to them, but we have to supplement it with more available phosphorus to be able to overcome some of the limitations we have, to answer both of your statements before, to give enough phosphorus early, because phosphorus is important for a number of reasons. Wrong. If you don't have enough phosphorus, what's the number one thing you're going to notice early in a season?
Well, you're going to notice stunted plants. You're going to see, the majority of the plants that you see early in the season, they're going to see a lot of purpling in the plants. Always a key indicator to phosphorus deficiency. But that stunted plant, that spindly plant, that plant that's just not wanting to grow. And then, you start looking at the root system on it, and you're going to notice right off the bat, there are no roots. And so in order to have roots, you've got to have phosphorus.
Molly, if you don't have phosphorus early, can you catch up later?
It would be a really hard pressed way to do that. Yes, you could potentially provide enough phosphorus throughout the season to have I won't even call it an ample amount. You'd have a amount that would continue to let the plant grow and catch up and mature in a way. But I think at this point, any phosphorus inputs or additives, whether it be, through soil applied or whether people try to put it in from the top down, it's still going to be a catch-up situation. Because at any point that it's missing at the time that the plant requires it is a catch-up situation.
I think that's something key we should talk about there, James, is we don't really ever want to be in a catch-up situation, And Molly's right. That's what it becomes. If we're deficient early, we become in a catch-up, and we never want to be chasing. We want to be leading.
I think that's a really valid point. Here's my final statement as we talk about this segment. So we've talked about the fact that phosphorus occurs in all soils. We understand where it comes from. We know that it only comes from nature, and it's something we can't manufacture. Why is it that it may be seen as an overlooked nutrient in terms of importance? When you're putting your fertilizer programs together, you always calculate, I'm going to grow X amount of corn, and your nutrient use efficiency when it comes to nitrogen. You always put nitrogen first on the list. And then you go through the rest of your nutrient management plan for your fertility aspect. When prices go high, one of the first things to get cut out is obviously phosphorus and potassium. Why is it that we look at phosphorus as something that we can take out of a program? Is it because we don't really understand the availability in the soil, or is it something that we just haven't seen a response to increased applications from, Molly?
Well,
I'll take this one first, if you don't care, Rob.
Go ahead.
So I think a lot of this goes back to creating a sort of a stigma around phosphorus. So nitrogen has had a stigma created around it. We know many crops, they're all essentially nitrogen dependent. And nitrogen plays a big factor in being able to visually see the crop go up and down in the responses. Phosphorus is really important early, but anything applied mid-season or throughout, we don't see that kind of visual big bump in the phosphorus additive. But most of these guys, when they're looking at their fertility program, they learn what an NPK is, but they also know that there's just a few different forms of phosphorus that's available to them. So they can get a MAP, or they can get a DAP, or, they can go in and get different forms of phosphorus, but they essentially don't know which form works best for their soil type. And then they also, when they look at a soil test, I think this is one of the most overlooked and less understood pieces of a soil test. They can look at a soil report and it can show that they have ample amounts of phosphorus on that soil test. But that does not necessarily mean that that phosphorus is available to the plant or to be utilized. It could have shown that they had a high amount of calcium in that soil, and that calcium has tied up that phosphorus. And so now what they're seeing on their soil report is an excess amount of phosphorus that's not available. So in their mind, they're saying we have plenty of phosphorus in our soil based on our soil report. We don't need to add any more. So it becomes now an afterthought instead of a thought that should have been important right up along with their nitrogen inputs.
I think that's a really good point, and it's a good segue. Obviously, there's the first episode of Agronomic Alchemy. Molly, you brought up one good thing is how to interpret soil tests. Follow us again on the next episode where we're going to talk about diving in to soil tests and understanding availability. Is that phosphorus in your soil, according to your soil test, enough to satisfy today's genetic potential? I mean, it was 11 minutes.